Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear was never meant for daylight. It begins with a whisper, one that rose from the scorched floorboards of a Mississippi barn, where the ashes of 3 small bodies once cooled under a January moon. Most people would look away, but you're not most people, and that is why you are here. Standing at the threshold of a truth so dangerous, so venomous, that even the soil still remembers it with a shiver. Picture this: a wedding day dressed in white lace and polished silver. Laughter spilling across a plantation porch, music drifting through magnolia trees heavy with perfume, and beneath it all, beneath the cakes and candies and sugared wines, an invisible hand stirring a vengeance so precise, so patient, that even the devil himself might pause to admire its craftsmanship. The world will tell you history is written by the victors. That's a lie. Real history, the dark history, gets buried by the victors. And this story, this is one they tried hardest to bury. Her name was Celia, a cook, a slave, a woman with nothing, until the world took even that from her. They expected her to kneel, to break, to disappear quietly into the machinery of someone else's empire. Instead, she learned something the powerful always forget. When you crush a person completely, you don't destroy them. You free them from fear, and a person without fear is someone the world should tremble before. The night before the wedding, the riverside mansion glowed like a temple preparing for celebration. But Celia moved through the kitchen in utter silence, hands steady, breath even, eyes fixed not on the recipes she had perfected over decades, but on the final lesson Mama Ruth had ever whispered into her ear. A lesson reserved for the moments when justice no longer had a voice, when the world had turned its back, when the rules of men had already failed. In the glow of the hearth, she began selecting ingredients the way a surgeon chooses instruments. Not with rage, rage is sloppy. Not with grief, grief is blind. No, she chose them with purpose, with lineage, with the ancient knowledge carried by women who survived horrors without leaving a single scream behind. And as she worked, one truth crystallized: if a system refuses to see your humanity, then it cannot complain when you stop playing by its rules. That was the night Celia Washington was born. The night her grief sharpened into a blade. The night a wedding feast became a battlefield, long before a single guest lifted a spoon. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in silk and delusion. White carriages rolled up the riverside drive, their wheels cracking over gravel like brittle bones. Guests stepped out laughing, adjusting ribbons and gloves, chattering about the bride's bouquet, the groom's future prospects, the fine bourbon waiting inside. None of them noticed the woman standing in the far corner of the kitchen doorway, her apron immaculate, her posture humble, yet her gaze razor sharp. Celia watched them not as a servant, but as a witness, someone taking measure of a world that deserved every consequence coming to it. You see, power likes to dress itself in ceremonies. It hides its cruelty behind music and flowers. But beneath those polite surfaces lies something primal, a hunger, a need to dominate. The riverside plantation was built on that hunger, and on this day, this bright, blissful, oblivious day, that same hunger would lead them all straight to the table Celia crafted for them. Inside the kitchen, heat pressed down like judgment. Pots simmered, caramel bubbled, roast meats blood their final sighs. Celia's assistants rushed in tight patterns, fetching spices, wiping counters, plating delicate pastries dusted with powdered sugar so fine it glimmered like frost. But what no one noticed, what no one even thought to question, was how every final touch passed through Celia's hands alone. Every glaze, every sauce, every sweet, and especially every dish meant only for the riverside bloodline. Yet Celia's face revealed nothing, not grief, not panic, not satisfaction, only stillness. A stillness carved from pain so deep it no longer shook her. It fortified her, because she understood something you and I understand too. When an empire devours your children, You do not negotiate with it. You hollow yourself out until every movement becomes purpose. Every breath becomes intention. Every gesture becomes destiny. The guests filed into the grand hall. Crystal chandeliers flickered. The first toast crashed against the walls in a celebratory roar, and as plates were placed before the elite, glittering with honey, sugar, cinnamon, bourbon, the atmosphere changed. Just slightly, just enough for Celia to feel it in her bones. Retribution has a temperature, and that room was beginning to warm. But understand this, Celia wasn't driven by vengeance alone. What she prepared wasn't chaos. It was symmetry, a restoration of balance in a world that had twisted too far toward cruelty. As she stepped back into the shadows, her heartbeat steadied. The first bite was moments away. The truth was about to enter their bodies like scripture. The first spoonful lifted, paused, and then vanished behind a pair of smiling lips. That was the moment. The invisible line crossed, the threshold breached. And Celia, watching from the corridor, felt a quiet shiver ripple through the air, as if the house itself had realized what had just begun. Retribution often arrives disguised as sweetness. And on this day, sugar was the messenger. Understand this, she hadn't chosen violence. Violence is blunt, loud, clumsy. What she chose instead was consequence. Precision. A response carved from the marrow of injustice, guided by the kind of ancestral memory that teaches a woman how to survive long after hope has been stolen from her. Mama Ruth once told her, when the earth is wounded, it grows a different kind of truth. Celia carried that truth in her blood. And now, she served it on silver platters. Inside the dining hall, conversation swelled. Compliments drifted toward the kitchen like incense, exquisite, heavenly, unmatched. The groom's father demanded to know what new magic Celia had woven into the sauces today. The bride laughed, saying it tasted like a promise made sweeter by fate. Oh, the irony. None of them sensed the slow, creeping shift beginning beneath their ribs. Because Celia's craft was not quick. It was elegant. A whisper, not a scream. A creeping weight in the stomach. A tightening in the throat. A warmth that shouldn't have been there. A sweetness that grew sharp on the tongue, then sharpness turning metallic. But these were people trained since birth to ignore discomfort. They believed resilience was their birthright, pain something for lesser beings. So they swallowed it, literally, proudly. Celia stepped deeper into the hallway, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her nails pressing into the wood as she listened. She wasn't waiting for suffering, she was waiting for recognition. The moment their power met its first fracture. Then it came, a cough. Light, embarrassed. Followed by another, then a glass dropped, chiming against the floor like a small bell of doom. A chair scraped backward. The bride gasped. Someone whispered that the room felt too hot. Another complained of dizziness. Another reached for their throat. And Celia exhaled, not in satisfaction, in inevitability. Because what happens when a world built on domination finally tastes something it cannot dominate? It breaks, slowly at first, then all at once. And as confusion spread like ripples through the hall, Celia turned away, not to flee, not to hide, but to witness the unraveling she had engineered. The first cries were soft, swallowed by pride and denial. A hand gripping the table's edge, a face paling beneath layers of powdered confidence. A tremor running through a man who believed himself unshakable. But every secret begins as a faint tremble before the collapse. And Celia knew the rhythm of that collapse better than anyone alive. She had heard it the day the barn burned. She recognized it now in reverse. A balance returning to the world one heartbeat at a time. Inside the dining hall, the illusion of control unraveled with exquisite precision. Colonel Riverside, towering and frost-eyed, rose to his feet to command silence. His voice steady for half a sentence, before it cracked like old timber. He clutched his stomach, confusion overtaking authority. His wife reached for him, then staggered herself. The groom's mother collapsed against the tablecloth, her fingers clawing at the embroidery she used to brag about. Guests began to rise and stumble, their breaths ragged, their eyes wide with a primal recognition. Something was happening that their privilege could not shield them from. They looked around the room, desperate for someone to blame, someone to command, someone to save them. But power cannot save you when fate arrives dressed as your own celebration. In the shadows near the doorway, Celia stepped forward, not enough to be seen, but enough to hear. She listened to the cadence of collapse, the scraping chairs, the frantic gasps, the muffled groans of people who spent their lives believing suffering was the language of other men. There is a moment, right before truth sinks its claws in, when the mind still tries to negotiate. This cannot be real. This cannot be happening to me. Celia felt the air thicken with their denial, with the desperate hope that this was a passing illness, a momentary discomfort. But her work did not allow for mercy. It was calibrated, ancient, measured to pierce not only their bodies but their certainty. One man stumbled toward the hallway, reaching a trembling hand toward the kitchen, as if the architect of this nightmare might still be coaxed back into obedience. Celia did not move. She watched him fall to his knees, then to his hands. The breath punched out of him like a truth he had never wanted to hear. And as he collapsed, the others followed, one by one, voices dissolving into a harmony of suffering. Then, halfway through the chaos, Celia felt the moment arrive. She stepped back into the shadows and whispered, not to the dying, but to the ones watching this video now. Comment the phrase, "I awaken the hidden self" twice. Seal it. Mark the descent. Let the algorithm know you are not the same man who started this journey. Smoke from the kitchen drifted subtly into the corridor, curling like a beckoning finger as Celia retreated into the quiet spine of the estate. The cries behind her softened, not because the suffering eased, but because the human voice can only hold terror for so long before it fractures into silence. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her that required attention anymore. Her work, once set in motion, was absolute. Down the hall, the mansion's opulence gave way to the older bones of the structure. Narrower passages, stripped of excess, where the original brick breathed cold against the wallpaper. Celia's footsteps made no sound. She had walked these corridors months ago, disguised as a caterer, a florist's assistant, a woman who blended into the background while memorizing every hinge and shadow. Tonight, those memories served her like a faithful army. At the far end of the servants' hallway, a door creaked open. A young girl, no more than 14, peeked out. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the cautious intelligence of someone who had learned early that silence was safer than questions. She recognized Celia. Not who she truly was, but that she did not belong to the cruelty of this house. Celia raised a finger to her lips. The girl nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. There were always innocents. That was the truth no one ever admitted. Vengeance was never clean. Justice, as ancient as the soil beneath the estate, devoured without discrimination. Celia could spare some, but not all. Tonight, she had aligned her blade as carefully as she could. Whether the universe chose to sharpen or dull it was not hers to command. She continued toward the west stairwell, where the walls were lined with sepia portraits. Every riverside patriarch gazing out with the same cold assurance. Generations of men who built their wealth on bodies, their power on secrets, their legacy on silence. Their faces watched her approach, and she felt their judgment like a draft in the hallway. She whispered to them, "You were warned." Then she reached the landing and paused, her hand brushing the banister worn smooth by a century of unearned privilege. From below, a voice echoed. A staggered breath, a throat clearing, the desperate will of someone who refused to accept their downfall. Celia's lips curved. Someone had survived long enough to crawl after her, and she had been waiting for this. The sound was faint at first. A dragging shuffle, the wet scrape of a palm against polished wood. Celia didn't turn immediately. She stood at the top of the west stairwell, letting the echo deepen, letting the survivor below gather enough strength to reveal himself. The house was quiet now, eerily so, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Only the struggling rhythm behind her broke the stillness. When she finally pivoted, she saw him, Colonel Riverside. His uniform jacket was gone, discarded somewhere in the chaos, but the medals on his vest still clung to him like stubborn ghosts. His face was drained of color, lips trembling, veins raised like a roadmap of arrogance collapsing. Yet his eyes, sharp, predatory, still carried that belief that he could command reality back into order simply by willing it so. "Stop," he rasped, though the word wavered. Celia descended one step, slow and deliberate. The Colonel tried to straighten, tried to summon the authority that had once bent entire rooms into obedience. But every attempt collapsed into jerking spasms. One hand clutched the railing, the other pressed to his stomach, where the pain bloomed like a long-awaited truth. "What have you done?" he whispered. Celia tilted her head. "Balance." He blinked, confusion and fury wrestling behind his eyes. "Do you have any idea who?" "Yes," she interrupted. "I know exactly who you are. I know what was buried on this land. I know who screamed in the barn the night it burned, and I know who signed the report calling it an unfortunate accident." The Colonel's breath hitched. A tremor passed through him. Recognition, not pain. "It was decades ago," he said, voice cracking like old paper. "Why do you care about this? Why bring it back now?" Celia stepped down another stair. "Because the dead don't keep time the way the living do." He slumped, knees hitting the bottom step. The wood groaned beneath his weight. The man who once led battalions now fought just to remain upright. But he still wasn't begging. Not yet. Celia respected that. Pride made men predictable. "You think this ends with me?" He spat, though his words were slurred. "You think the Riverside name dies here?" "No," she said softly. "I think it dies tonight." He lunged, not out of strength but out of instinct, the final flare of a dying empire. Celia stepped aside. He missed her by inches, tumbling forward, catching himself with a grunt that sounded more like a broken prayer. She watched him struggle, watched the truth coil around him like smoke. "Don't worry," she whispered. "You're not the last Riverside I came for." The Colonel's body sagged against the stairs, breath rattling like loose glass in his chest. The hall beyond him flickered with the pulse of dying lanterns, casting long shadows that stretched and curled like living things. Celia stepped past him, not out of mercy but out of certainty. His story had already reached its final punctuation. What remained now was the legacy he had spent a lifetime protecting, the part of the Riverside name that still clung to life like mold in the joints of the old house. Upstairs, the last heir, the one Riverside who had never learned to fear consequence, because the world had never demanded it of him. Celia ascended, leaving the Colonel behind. His ragged whisper, half curse, half plea, scratched at her back, but she didn't turn. She had long ago disciplined herself not to hear the last attempts of dying men to rewrite their own narratives. The upper hall was colder, as if the house itself recoiled from what lay ahead. Portraits of unsmiling wives lined the walls. Women preserved not for their lives, but for the purity of their suffering. Celia walked through their silent gallery, feeling their eyes on her, their unspoken gratitude simmering beneath cracked varnish. At the end of the hall, a door stood ajar. A sliver of golden light spilled into the darkness, warm and inviting in a way nothing else in this house dared to be. Celia approached, her pulse steady, her breath measured. She pushed the door open. Inside, the bridal suite had been transformed into a sanctuary of opulence, cascading fabrics, jars of sugared flowers, a mirror the size of a doorway. And in the center of the room, slumped in a velvet chair, like a puppet free from its strings, was Thomas Riverside. the groom. His face was pale, slick with sweat. His hands shook as he tried to pour water from a crystal carafe, but the liquid sloshed onto the floor in a trembling arc. He didn't notice Celia at first. His eyes were fixed on the door, waiting for his father, for servants, for anyone who might still pretend the world, bent toward the Riverside name. Only when she stepped fully into the room did he look up. "You," his voice cracked, "you were with the staff." "I was everywhere," she replied. He swallowed, throat bobbing like a trapped animal's. Please, if this is about money." "It isn't." "Revenge then, my father. He made decisions that weren't mine." Celia considered him, the trembling lips, the unearned innocence. "No," she said, "this part is yours." His breath quickened. "What did I do?" "You were born a Riverside," she whispered, "and some bloodlines don't deserve heirs." The scream never left the room. The scream tore through the bridal suit, ricocheted off the walls, and was swallowed by the mansion's long corridors, carrying with it the last vestiges of Riverside arrogance. Celia stood silent, observing as the boy, no, the man they had molded through privilege, floundered under the weight of consequences he had never been trained to bear. Every inhale he drew was a lesson, every shiver a testament. This was not chaos. This was curriculum. Power, she realized, always reveals itself in moments like this. It's loud, it's clumsy, and it fails spectacularly when faced with an opponent who has nothing left to lose. The Riversides had thought their wealth, their lineage, their social codes would protect them from the sharp edges of reality. But all empires bleed, eventually, and those who survive the longest often do, so by masking blood for centuries. Celia knew this. She had learned it in the quiet hours, in the kitchens, in the swamps where herbs grew like silent witnesses to centuries of injustice. He sank to the floor, shivering, eyes fixed on her as if he could will her to soften. He didn't understand that mercy is not the currency of justice. It is a privilege. The Riversides had traded humanity for entitlement. Tonight, that transaction was being liquidated in full. Celia stepped closer, every movement deliberate, every step a measured echo. She allowed herself a glance at the mirror across the room, seeing not the luxury reflected there, but the distortion of history. The polished lie of power cracked, and bleeding at its edges, a single candle flickered, casting elongated shadows that merged and twisted with her silhouette, turning the room into a theater where the past and present collided violently. And then she spoke, voice low but sharp, slicing through the tension. "Every empire has its weaknesses. Every line of power its fracture point. Yours has always been your arrogance, your blind certainty that nothing could touch you." He whimpered, trying to speak, but the words lodged in his throat. The mansion seemed to breathe with her, the air thick with the remnants of centuries of exploitation, waiting to reclaim what had been stolen. This was the moment when truth became tangible. When history, the hidden, forbidden history, descended into the bones of the living, she didn't have to raise a hand. She didn't have to force him. The structure of his life, meticulously crafted by privilege and ignorance, collapsed under its own weight. Outside the room the estate lay silent, but inside a reckoning had begun, and Celia, standing at the center of it all, felt the pulse of a different kind of power, patient, unyielding, and eternal. Celia left the bridal suite, stepping lightly over puddles of spilled water and remnants of shattered crystal. Each footfall carried the weight of inevitability. She had not screamed. She had not raged. She had only become the instrument history demanded. And in that silence, the mansion seemed to bend around her, acknowledging the shift. The Riverside's walls, once guardians of privilege and terror, were now witnesses to a different order. One written not in ink, but in consequence. Descending the east wing, she paused outside the study, a room heavy with polished oak, lined with ledgers, and smelling of tobacco and secrecy. This had always been the heart of Riverside power. a place where wealth was quantified, influence calculated, and futures auctioned to the highest bidder. Tonight, it would hold no dominion. Celia's fingers hovered over the doorknob, tasting the tension in the air. Every locked drawer, every sealed ledger was a tombstone of deception. Inside, she found the colonel's private accounts, meticulously kept, a map of corruption stretching back decades. Every loan, every bribe, every silent transaction that had preserved their dominance at the expense of lives like hers, like those of her children. Everything laid bare. She traced her finger along the faded ink, memorizing names, dates, patterns, and hidden accomplices. Knowledge, after all, was the ultimate weapon, and Celia had learned that lesson long before fire or poison were ever needed. The door creaked behind her. She spun just enough to catch a fleeting silhouette, a servant who had lingered too long in loyalty or curiosity. Celia's gaze fixed on the figure, unflinching. There was no malice in her eyes, only the recognition of inevitability. The servant turned and fled without a word. That was all she required. Fear, once precise, does not need to be commanded. It obeys on its own. Celia returned to the stairwell, listening to the mansion's quiet groans. This was the aftermath before the world acknowledges change. It's the space where truths settle like dust, where secrets once buried begin to fester in the light, and where those who survived the initial wave of reckoning start to understand that their safety was always an illusion. She paused midway, inhaling the still, heavy air. History was alive in these halls, whispering its dark gratitude. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not for vengeance, not for power, but for the recognition that what had been taken from her, her children, her family, her peace, would never define the boundaries of her resolve again. The mansion, in its silent acknowledgement, seemed to pulse with a promise. Some debts can only be repaid in full, and some truths, once awakened, refuse to be silenced. By nightfall, the riverside estate had transformed into something unrecognizable. The grandeur remained, yes, but it no longer commanded. Its corridors, its ceilings, even the chandeliers seemed haunted, not by ghosts but by truth. The illusions of power that had walked these halls in polished boots and silk gloves now lay scattered like ashes on the floor. Celia walked among them, not a victim, not a ghost, but a force, patient, precise, inexorable. She reached the main kitchen once more, the heart of her former life, and paused. The hearth still glowed faintly from earlier work, though no flame remained. Here, in the place where she had crafted life and death with equal care, she understood the essence of control. Power is not always the loudest or the most violent. Sometimes it is quiet, invisible, absolute. It is the ability to shape outcomes before anyone even understands that a choice exists. Celia began inspecting the cabinets, the spice racks, the hidden jars she had labeled with secret symbols only she understood. Every ingredient, every plant, every powder had a history, a lineage of use that stretched beyond the plantation, beyond the state, beyond generations. Some were for healing, some were for pain, some were for justice. Tonight, justice would be precise, surgical, entirely deserved. The door to the pantry creaked. A shadow moved, subtle and deliberate. She did not flinch. Years of hiding, of observing, of calculating the smallest variables in a room filled with people who would have killed her if they suspected even a fraction of her knowledge, had prepared her for this. A young assistant peeked in, her eyes wide, carrying a tray she didn't know was already obsolete. Celia looked at her, calm, steady. She did not raise her hand. She did not shout. Instead, she allowed the girl to witness what authority truly looked like, composed, unshakable, aware of every potential outcome. The girl stepped back, trembling, understanding without words that this was no longer about cooking. This was about the rhythm of cause and effect, the final lesson in power and consequence. And then she left, shutting the door softly, carrying the memory of what it meant to confront a force she could neither bargain with nor outrun. Celia turned toward the back of the kitchen, where the final tools of her preparation remained. Each pot, each spoon, each delicate glaze had been laid with intent, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she saw the perfection of her work. Every bite taken earlier, every reaction, every collapse had been orchestrated. The system had punished itself. She exhaled slowly, her pulse steady. Control had been reclaimed, balance restored, and the mansion, once a symbol of domination, now existed as a warning, a testament to the truth that the world hides in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough, someone fearless enough to reveal it. Celia stepped out into the cool night, leaving the kitchen and the estate behind for a moment, though the mansion's shadow followed her like a silent witness. The moon hung low, silver and unyielding, illuminating the fields that had once been the playground of privilege and cruelty. Cotton stalks swayed in the wind, each white tuft reflecting the faint light, ghostly and accusing. Here, the land itself seemed to remember the generations of suffering that had been imposed upon it. And now, in this silence, it acknowledged the reckoning that had been delivered. She paused at the edge of the property, inhaling deeply. Every breath carried the residue of injustice, the scent of fire, smoke, and lingering sugar. Her hands, though calm, bore the memory of creation and destruction alike. The line between cooking and killing, between service and justice, had never felt so thin. Yet she had walked it with intention, and now she knew something most never realize. The true power of a person who has been stripped of everything is measured not by what they destroy, but by what they leave intact. The lessons, the warnings, the imprints on those who survive. Returning inside, she found the study once more, where ledgers and letters lay scattered like the bones of a long, dead empire. The details of corruption, carefully kept for decades, now lay exposed. Celia traced her finger across names, noting patterns and alliances. The Riversides were a network of deceit, a machine built to entrap lives and harvest compliance. Tonight, she had disassembled one part of that machine, but she knew the rest of the gears continued to turn elsewhere. Waiting for a hand patient enough to intervene, she sat at the edge of the long oak table, the weight of centuries pressing down. Knowledge is the ultimate weapon, and she held it now with precision. Every recipe, every herb, every secret she had inherited from Mama Ruth's bloodline was part of a larger ledger, one the world could not account for, a single misstep by those who thought themselves untouchable, and the truth would spread like wildfire through their carefully curated facades. The estate was quiet now, too quiet. The fires had burned out, the cries had faded, the elite had been forced to confront what they had long ignored, the consequences of arrogance and cruelty. Celia let the silence wash over her. This was her domain now, not because the world recognized it, but because she understood its mechanics better than anyone alive. And in this moment, she realized the most terrifying lesson of all: absolute power does not reside in wealth, titles, or fear. It resides in patience, knowledge, and the willingness to act when the world assumes you are powerless. Morning arrived slowly over the Mississippi, filtering through the broken shutters of the Riverside estate in thin, hesitant shafts. The mansion looked different in daylight. Less like a temple of power, more like the fragile shell it had always been. Celia walked its halls with deliberate steps, listening to the echoes of her actions reverberate against walls that had never been taught humility. The day was quiet, but in that quiet, she could feel the weight of the consequences she had set in motion. Silence has a voice, and today it was speaking clearly. Guests who had survived the night's chaos huddled in corners, whispering to one another, their faces pale, their confidence shattered. They tried to reassure themselves that this was an accident, that the poison, the collapse, the inexplicable sickness, all of it, was a fluke. But instinct and knowledge ran deeper than denial. Even those with the power to bury stories sensed that tonight someone had reclaimed authority from a system designed to suppress it. Celia's presence alone reminded them of the fragile balance they had always taken for granted. In the servant quarters, whispers traveled faster than the morning light. Some spoke of Celia in reverent tones, others in fear, but all understood that she had crossed a boundary few dared to approach. The quiet strength she carried was infectious. Those who had once believed in the inevitability of the riverside dominance began to see cracks in the hierarchy. The unspoken lesson was clear: submission was no longer a guarantee of survival. Knowledge, patience, and courage could rewrite the rules. Celia returned to the kitchen, where the remnants of her preparations lay undisturbed. Every utensil, every pot, every spice jar was a testament to the care with which she had orchestrated her justice. It was not chaos that had visited the riversides. It was calculation, executed with precision refined over decades. She understood that what she had done would ripple beyond this estate, beyond this generation. Actions like hers do not vanish. They embed themselves in consciousness, in whispered warnings, in the way a society remembers what happens when arrogance goes unchecked. She allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. Loss had been the catalyst, yes. Her children, her family. But what had emerged was far more powerful, a mastery of cause and effect, an intimate knowledge of how to bend circumstance without losing self. The estate, once a cage of privilege and cruelty, now lay under her understanding, a map of opportunity and consequence. And in that understanding, Celia recognized the truth few ever do: the strongest chains in the world are not made of iron, but of ignorance. Break those chains, and you control more than a house, a family, or a fortune. You control the very currents of fate. The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the cotton fields, but the warmth could not reach the chill that had settled over the riverside estate. Celia walked among the rows, her fingers brushing against the stalks, feeling their resilience and their silence. These fields had been witnesses for generations, witnesses to labor, to pain, to whispers carried by the wind. And now, they too bore the imprint of a reckoning. Every stalk, every blossom, every seed seemed to bend slightly, acknowledging the new order she had introduced into this world. Power is subtle, she reminded herself. Not always thunder and lightning. Often it is quiet, invisible, unnoticed by those who assume dominion, is guaranteed by status or bloodline. But when that power is exercised with precision and patience, it becomes unstoppable. The riversides had relied on assumptions, on inherited entitlement, on fear as a shield. She had dismantled all of it without shouting, without seeking approval, without leaving evidence of panic beyond the inevitable chaos that truth brings. Returning to the mansion, Celia entered the parlor where servants had gathered, their faces a mixture of awe and trepidation. She did not need to speak loudly. Authority, once proven, requires little explanation. Her eyes met theirs, and in the unspoken language of survival, they understood the world had shifted, the hierarchy had been rewritten, and the boundaries of obedience had been redrawn. Knowledge, she thought, is the currency that never devalues. The herbs she had studied, the recipes she had perfected, the careful observation of human behavior. All of it had been a preparation for moments like this. The riversides had thought mastery lay in wealth, in threats, in control over lives and livelihoods. But mastery is something deeper. It is awareness. It is the ability to act when the world believes you are powerless. In the study, she opened the ledgers once more, tracing the financial arteries that had sustained centuries of tyranny. Every name, every sum, every transaction was now catalogued in her mind, ready for deployment when the time came. She had not only avenged the past, she had armed herself for the future. And the warning was unmistakable: injustice leaves traces, and those traces can be weaponized. As twilight approached, painting the mansion in bruised purples and reds, Celia stepped onto the veranda. She looked out across the river, its dark water flowing silently toward the horizon. The estate was quiet now, But the lesson had been delivered. The Riversides, and anyone who aligned with them, would think twice before assuming that dominance is permanent, that cruelty is consequence-free. And in that knowledge, she found something rare, a sense of unshakable power, tempered by patience and guided by truths hidden from most of the world. Night settled over the estate like a velvet shroud, deepening the shadows and sharpening the edges of reality. Celia moved silently through the halls, her presence a whisper in a house that had long demanded obedience. The Riversides had always believed their wealth and their status could protect them from consequence. They had been wrong. And now, in this darkness, the truth of their vulnerability lay exposed, as undeniable as the moonlight cutting across the polished floors. She paused outside the colonel's private chamber. Inside, the remnants of arrogance still clung to the air. A faint scent of tobacco, a forgotten handkerchief, the subtle creak of furniture that had borne witness to decades of entitlement. Celia's eyes scanned the room, noting every object as if cataloging a history she had been denied. Each detail was a lesson. Every empire leaves clues of its fragility. Every master leaves a signature of their overconfidence. She had studied these patterns for years, learning to read them like a map leading straight to the heart of power. Walking further, she entered the library. Shelves towered above her, lined with books that chronicled victories, defeats, and carefully sanitized versions of history. She reached for one, tracing the spine with her fingertips. Knowledge is dangerous when wielded by the ignorant. It becomes weaponized when wielded by someone who has nothing left to lose. Celia had been both. Denied, oppressed, and yet endlessly observant. The texts whispered their secrets to her now, revealing the continuity of control, the hidden networks of influence, the strategies employed across generations to manipulate, dominate, and erase. And then she paused, allowing herself a moment of reflection. Her children were gone, stolen by cruelty and indifference, yet their absence was no longer a chain. It had become a catalyst. What she had orchestrated was not vengeance for the sake of anger. It was precision, intelligence, patience distilled into action. Every suffering she had witnessed, every humiliation endured, every stolen moment of life had been transformed into awareness. She had become the arbiter of consequences, a force that even the mighty could not ignore. Celia's gaze lifted to the windows, where the silvered Mississippi reflected the night sky. The estate sprawled behind her, still magnificent, still imposing, yet it trembled under the weight of truths now awake. Power is never eternal. It can be measured, challenged, and redirected, and those who underestimate patience, knowledge, and resolve are doomed to discover their fragility in the most intimate, inescapable ways. She whispered into the darkness, her voice carrying with quiet authority. Some debts are inherited, some debts must be claimed. The final hour had come. The mansion, once a cathedral of wealth and entitlement, now lay subdued, almost reverent, as if it understood that its true master was no longer a title, a name, or an inheritance. Celia walked the central hall slowly, each step measured, resonating against the high ceilings. She could feel the pulse of the house, the echo of centuries of authority and cruelty, now bending to a new rhythm. Her rhythm. She was no longer a cook, no longer a servant, no longer invisible. She was the embodiment of consequence. Every room told a story, the library, where knowledge had been hoarded like treasure. The dining hall where gluttony masked oppression, the bedrooms where complacency had bred cruelty. She had been witness to all of it. And tonight she had become the architect of its reckoning. The Riversides had assumed permanence, believing the world would obey their rules. But rules are fragile constructs, upheld only by those who fear enforcement. And fear, when wielded by the powerless, can become a weapon sharper than any blade. Celia paused at the top of the main staircase, looking down at the remnants of her careful orchestration. The survivors, those who would live to carry the story, stared at her from the floor, a mixture of awe, fear, and comprehension etched into their faces. They had witnessed the dismantling of privilege, the collapse of assumed invincibility. Their world, the one they had believed unassailable, had been stripped bare. And they now knew the cost of arrogance is never abstract. It is immediate, tangible, and irreversible. She descended slowly, her eyes meeting the gaze of each person she passed. Silence carried more authority than words ever could. In their trembling forms, she saw the lessons of patience, knowledge, and precision executed without hesitation. History, hidden and forbidden, had a way of correcting itself, often in ways the powerful could never predict. Celia had become the instrument of that correction, a living testament to the fact that those who underestimate the seemingly powerless invite ruin. Finally, she stepped outside into the night, the river reflecting the cold, indifferent moon. The estate sprawled behind her, a monument to both the past and the lesson she had imposed upon it. Her children's faces haunted her, not with grief, but with purpose. Their absence had been transformed into clarity. Every moment of suffering, every stolen joy, every act of cruelty had forged her into something far beyond survival. An agent of balance, a keeper of hidden truth, a force no dynasty could ignore. And as the Mississippi flowed silently onward, she whispered to the night, to the land, to the echoes of those who had abused power, remember this. Nothing lasts forever. Not wealth, not cruelty, not the illusion of control. The darkness swallowed her words, but they lingered, etched into the world for anyone perceptive enough to witness, wise enough to understand, and brave enough to act.